I've been asked today to talk to you on entrepreneurship, starting a business and personal branding. And I thought I would start with the idea of a job is the default. People get regular jobs, right? It's the default thing to do. Defaults are enormously powerful precisely because they operate without any conscious choice. To almost everyone except criminals, it seems an axiom that if you need money, you should get a job. But what if I told you that actually this tradition is not much more than 100 years old? Before that, the default way to make a living was by farming. It's a bad plan to treat something only 100 years old as an axiom. By historical standards, that's something changing pretty rapidly by today. By seeing another such change coming, we've managed to stop, to pause. I've spent a lot of time reading about economic history, and I understand the startup world pretty well. And it now seems to me fairly likely that we're seeing the beginning of a change like the one from farming to manufacturing. If you'd been around when the change began, this is about 1,000 years ago in Europe, it would have seemed to nearly everyone that running off to the big bad city to make your fortune was a crazy thing to do. Though serfs were principally forbidden to leave their manors. It can't have been that hard to run away to the city. There were no guards patrolling the perimeter of the village. That prevented most serfs from leaving was the fact that it was insanely risky. Leaving one's plot of land, leaving the people you'd spent your whole life with, to live in a giant city of 3,000 to 4,000 people, 3,000 to 4,000 complete strangers. How would you live? How would you get food if you didn't grow it? Frightening as it seemed to them, it's now the default with us to live by our wits. So if it seems risky to you to start a startup or be an entrepreneur, think how risky it once was to your ancestors to live as you do now. Oddly enough, the people who know this best are the very ones trying to get you to stick to the old model. How can Zuckerberg say you should come work for me when he didn't get a job himself? Now we look back on medieval peasants and wonder how they stood it, how grim it must have been to be in the same fields your whole life with no hope of anything better under the thumb of lords and priests you had to give your surplus to, and to acknowledge these masters. I wouldn't be surprised if one day people look back at what we consider a normal job today in the same way. How grim it would be to commute every day to a cubicle in some soulless office complex, to be told what to do by someone who had to acknowledge was your boss, someone who could call you into office and say those scary words, "Take a seat," and you'd sit. Imagine having to ask permission to release software to users or try new things. Imagine being sad on Sunday afternoons because the weekend was almost over and tomorrow you'd have to get up and go to work. How did they stand it back in the day? It's exciting to think we may be on the cusp of another shift like the one from farming to manufacturing. And that's why I care about startups and entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship isn't interesting just because it's a great way to make a lot of money and travel the world living the rich life. I couldn't care less about other ways to do that, like speculating in securities. At most, those are interesting the way that puzzles are interesting. There's more going on, however, with startups and entrepreneurship. They present one of those rare historic shifts in the way wealth is created. That's ultimately what drives us to be entrepreneurs. We want to make money, if only so we never have to stop doing what we do. There have only been a handful of these great economic shifts in human history. Wouldn't it be amazing to hack one and make it happen faster? Before I begin, I think we need to start with what is a startup versus starting a business. So before I explain that, let me tell you what it is. A startup is a company designed to grow fast. Fast growth has become the measure of success in the startup ecosystem. And rather than something to avoid, it enables long-term success and sustainable business. Startups are really very counterintuitive, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just because knowledge about them hasn't yet permeated into our culture. But for whatever reason, starting a startup is a task where you can't always trust your instincts. It's like skiing in that way. When you first try skiing and you want to slow down, your instinct is to lean back. But if you lean back on your skis, you fly down even faster, out of control. So part of learning to ski is learning to suppress that impulse. Eventually, you get new habits, but at first it takes a conscious effort. At first, there's a list of things you're trying to remember as you start down the hill. Startups are as unnatural as skiing. So there's a similar list for startups. Here I'm going to give you the first part of it, the things to remember if you want to prepare yourself to start a startup. Number one, counterintuitive. The first item on the facts I already mentioned is that startups are so weird that if you trust your instincts, you'll make a lot of mistakes. If you know nothing more than this, you may at least pause before making those mistakes. When I first started talking about startups or business or entrepreneurship, I used to joke that my function was to tell founders things they would definitely ignore. And it's true. Talk after talk, I used to warn founders about mistakes they're about to make, and the founders ignored them, and then come back a year later and say, oh my gosh, Jason, I should have listened. Why do founders ignore advice? Well, that's the thing about counterintuitive ideas. They contradict your intuition. They seem wrong. So of course your first impulse is to disregard them. And in fact, my joking description is not merely the curse of entrepreneurship, but part of its raison d'etre. If founders' instincts always gave them the right answers, they wouldn't need speakers like me or coaches or consultants. You only need other people to give you advice that surprises you. That's why they are there. And that's why there are a lot of more ski instructors than running instructors. You can, however, trust your instincts about people. And in fact, one of the most common mistakes young founders make is not to do that enough. They get involved with people who seem impressive, but about whom they feel some sort of misgivings personally. Later, those things blow up and they say, I knew there was something off about him or her, but I ignored it because they seemed impressive. If you're thinking about getting involved with someone as a co-founder, an employee, an investor, or an acquirer, and you have misgivings about them, trust your gut. If someone seems slippery or bogus or a jerk, don't ignore it. My mentor said to me, if you feel froggy, jump. This is one case where it pays to be self-indulgent. Work with people who you genuinely like and who you've known long enough to be sure. The second is expertise. It's not important to know a lot about startups. The way to succeed in a startup is not to become an expert on startups, but to be an expert on your users and the problem you're solving for them. Mark Zuckerberg didn't succeed because he was an expert on startups. He succeeded despite being a complete noob at startups because he understood his users really well. If you don't know anything about how an angel round runs, don't feel bad on that account. That sort of thing you can learn when you need to and forget the moment you've done it. In fact, I worry not merely unnecessarily, people go into this idea of learning the mechanics of a startup. I know I did when I did mine, and it's dangerous. If I met an entrepreneur who knew all about convertible notes and employee agreements and, God forbid, class FF stock, I wouldn't think here is someone who is way ahead of their peers. It would set off alarm bells, because another of the characteristic mistakes of young founders is to go through the motions of starting a startup. They make up some plausible sounding idea. They raise money at good valuation. They rent a cool office. They hire a bunch of people from the outside. This all seems like this is what startups do. But the next step after renting a cool office and hiring a bunch of people is gradually realizing how completely messed up they are. Because while imitating all the outward forms of a startup, they have neglected the one thing that's actually essential, making something people want. Game theory. I see this happen over and over and over. We call it playing house. Eventually, I realized what was happening. The reason most young founders go through the motions of starting a startup is because that's what they've been trained to do for their whole lives up to this point. Think about what you have to go to right now in school, in college, and university. Extracurricular activities, check. College classes, check. It's like running laps. You know exactly what you do, and you just do it again and again and again. And I'm not attacking the educational system. No, it's brilliant. But we learn that there's a certain amount of fakeness in the work you do when you've been taught something. If you measure the performance, it's inevitable that people will exploit the difference to the point where much of what you're measuring is artifacts of the fakeness. And don't get me wrong, I confess, I did it myself. I found that in a lot of classes, there might only be 20 or 30 ideas that were the right shape to make a good exam question. The way I studied for exams in these classes was not, except incidentally, to master the material taught to the class, but to make a list of potential exam questions and work out the answers in advance. When I walked into the final, the main thing I'd be feeling was curiosity about which of my questions would turn up on the exam. It was a game, it's game theory. It's not surprising that after being trained like this your whole lives to play such games, young founders like you, first impulse in starting a startup is to try to figure out what the tricks of winning at this new game is. Since fundraising appears to be the measure of success for startups, you always want to know all the tricks for convincing investors. I tell people, and everyone I know does, The best way to convince investors is to make a startup that's actually doing well, meaning growing fast, and then simply tell investors so. Then they want to know what the tricks are for growing fast. And we have to tell them the best way to do that is to simply make something people want. So many of the conversations I have with young founders begin with the founders asking, how do we? And I go, just. Why do the founders always make things so complicated? The reason, I realized after a lot of work, especially in podcasting and writing books, is that they're looking for the trick. So this is the third counterintuitive thing to remember about startups. Starting a startup is where gaming the systems stops working. Gaming the system may continue to work if you go to work for a big company. Depending on how broken the company is, you can succeed by sucking up to the right people, giving the impression of productivity, and so on and so on. But that doesn't work with startups. There is no boss to trick, only users, and all users care about is whether your products do what they say they do and answer a problem. Startups are as impersonal as physics. You have to make something people want, and you prosper only to the extent that it does. The dangerous thing is faking does work to some degree on investors. If you're super good at sounding like you know what you're talking about, you can fool investors for at least one and perhaps even 2 rounds of funding. But it's not in your interest to. The company ultimately will be doomed. All you're doing is wasting your own time and writing it down. So stop looking for the trick. There are tricks in startups, as there are in any domain, but they are in order of magnitude less important than solving real problems. A founder who knows nothing about fundraising but has made something users love will have an easier time raising money than one who knows every trick in the book but has a flat usage graph. And more importantly, the founder who has made something users love is the one who will go on to succeed after raising the money. Though, in a sense, it's bad news in that you're deprived of one of the most powerful weapons. I think it's exciting that gaming the system stops working when you start a startup. It's exciting that there's even a world that exists where doing good work equals a good result. Imagine how depressing the world would be if all it were was like school and big companies, where you either have to spend a lot of time on nonsense things or lose to people who do. I would have been delighted if I had realized in college that there were parts of the real world where gaming the system mattered less than others, and a few where it hardly mattered at all. But this variation is the most important thing to consider when you're thinking about your future. How do you win in each type of work? And what would you like to win by doing? The next very important thing to understand is that it's all consuming. This is our fourth counterintuitive point. Startups are all consuming. If you start a startup, it will take over your life to a degree you cannot imagine. And if your startup succeeds, it will take over your life for a long time, for several years at the very least, maybe a decade, maybe for the rest of your working life. So there's a real opportunity cost here. Larry Page may seem to have an enviable life, but there are aspects of it that are far from enviable. Basically, at 25, he started running as fast as he could, and it must seem to him that he has never stopped to catch his breath since. Every day, new stuff happens in the Google empire that only the CEO can deal with, and he, as CEO, has to deal with it. If he goes on vacation for even a week, a whole week's backlog of stuff accumulates, and he has to bear this uncomplainingly, partly because he is the company's daddy and he can never show fear of weakness, and partly because billionaires get less than zero empathy if they talk about having difficult lives, which has the strange side effect that the difficulty of being a successful startup founder is concealed from almost everyone, except those of us who've done it. I've now stated and sold several companies in 3 continents, and in every single case, I can say the same thing. It never gets easier. The nature of the problems change. You're worrying about construction delays, your London office, instead of the broken air conditioner in your studio apartment. But the total volume of worry never decreases. If anything, it increases. Starting a successful startup is similar to having kids in that it's like a button you push that changes your life forever. And while it's truly wonderful having kids, I'm told, there are a lot of things that are easier to do before you have them, or maybe even after, many of which will make you a better parent when you do have kids. And since you can delay pushing the button for a while, because you're in a good country, as most are, when it comes to startups, I tell people to stop, to think, to wonder if there are other things to begin with. If there more time spent on having the life before giving that life to a startup. I know universities have a certain system, and teaching entrepreneurship and startup incubators and accelerators is part of it. But I think as important as possibly handing out contraceptive, it's important to talk about the downfalls of giving your life, your young life, to something that might completely take over. There is a pressure to own this space. And what I hope is that universities teach students about startups, yes and no. But they teach students about startups in the fact that it is all-encompassing, that it is hard work, that it's about fast growth, that it's about users, that it cannot be gamed. So starting a startup is intrinsically something you can only really learn by doing. And it's impossible to do that in college for the reasons I've just explained. Startups take over your life. If you want to start a startup one day, what should you do now? Two things. You need initially an idea and co-founders. And the MO for getting both is the same, which leads to our sixth and last allied counterintuitive point. The way to get better at startups is to keep making startups. I wrote a whole essay for this for the Association of MBAs to Universities, and I won't repeat it all here. You think of startup ideas, the ideas you come up with will not merely be bad, but bad and plausible sounding, meaning you'll waste a lot of time on them before realizing they're bad. Trust me, Google Jason Allan Scott, venue me. The way to come up with a good startup idea is take a step back. Instead of making conscious effort to think of startup ideas, turn your mind into the type of startup ideas that form without any conscious effort. In fact, so unconsciously that you don't even realize at first that they're a startup idea. This is not only possible, it's how Apple, Yahoo, Google, and Facebook all got started. None of these companies were even meant to be companies at first. They were side projects. And the best startups almost have to start as side projects because great ideas tend to be such outliers that your conscious mind would reject them as ideas for true companies. So how do you turn your mind into the type that starts startup ideas unconsciously? Number one, learn a lot about the things that matter. Then two, work on problems that interest you. And three, work with people you like. The third part, incidentally, is how you get co-founders at the same time as the idea. The first time I wrote that paragraph, instead of learning a lot of things that matter, I wrote, become good at some technology. But that prescription, though sufficient, is too narrow. What was special about Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia was not that they were experts in technology. They were good at design. And perhaps even more importantly, they were good at organizing groups and making projects happen. You don't have to work on technology per se, as long as you work on problems demanding enough to stretch you. What kind of problems are those? And that is very hard to answer in the general. History is full of examples of young people who were working on important problems that no one else at the time thought were important, and in particular, that their parents didn't think were important. On the other hand, history is even fuller of examples of parents who taught their kids that they were wasting their time and turned out to be right. So maybe the most optimal thing for you to do is to simply focus on entrepreneurship. Now you've noticed I can't say the word entrepreneur, but you might ask, what is an entrepreneur? Well, it's just someone who organizes a venture to benefit from an opportunity rather than working as an employee. That's it. The word entrepreneur stems from the economist Schumpeter back in the early 1900s, and back then he gave real meaning to the term entrepreneur. He said it's a risk taker who constantly procreates innovation by combining all necessary means of production to realize his business idea. In other words, creative destruction, which implies a successful adaptation of innovation that replaces old technologies. And remember, a typewriter was technology, a chair was technology. So an entrepreneur is an owner of a business that he or she demonstrates entrepreneurial activity and takes calculated risks. It has more to do with an entrepreneurial mindset than owning a business, I feel. I feel an entrepreneur is an enterprising business owner. My entrepreneurship definition has a high overlap with the definition of just an entrepreneur. It is a continuing process of spotting opportunities, exploiting them, creating value, more than economic growth alone, especially in social entrepreneurship, and then doing it again and again and again. To propel in this process, you need the building blocks of business, like an idea, an opportunity, passion, people, profit, organization, marketing, sales, and finance. But it starts with an idea that you can make money off. Therefore, it's irrelevant if you're an aspiring entrepreneur with a new business or a CEO of your own business. If you have an entrepreneurial personality, that changes everything. The qualities, the style, the thinking, the behavior, that's more important than having a registered company. Many ask, what's the difference between the thinking of an entrepreneur versus a non-entrepreneur? Budding entrepreneurs see multiple business opportunities for a product or service that they want to bring to market. Furthermore, entrepreneurs like to grow independently of venture or enterprise. In other words, they love risk-taking. And I've been told this over and over and over. That's not true. Always. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've sold multiple companies, and I don't believe this. I mean, I believe starting a multiple business is a serial entrepreneur, but not believing that risk is the only way. I lower my risk profile as low as possible. When I started a t-shirt company at the age of 25 with nothing but $1,000 to my name, I ended up selling it for 190,000 because I bought a t-shirt. I got someone to pay $5 for a t-shirt and a print. I paid $1 for a t-shirt, and I paid 50 cents for a print, and I made $3.50 profit. And I just did it again and again and again. My risk profile was very low. I just was going out and selling. I wasn't buying t-shirts first. My generation, we believed in something called, if you build it, they will come. Your generation has taught us something far greater. Find out if people are thirsty. Find out if people have money in their pockets to pay for this problem to be solved, and then go out and get water and supply it. I would go one step further. I would find out that they're thirsty, find out where water is the best answer. I would ask for the money in advance to prove it's not only a hungry or thirsty market, but it's a market people are willing to pay to solve. Then go off and get it, and then take the exchange as the money. As I said, money buys time. There is something else that we need to talk about, only because I was asked, because it's how I've made myself businesses and how I've allowed myself to travel all over the world, and do whatever I want, and live what many consider an incredibly rich life. Personal brand. You got to understand what personal brand is. And I think the easiest way is to think of it as a company. A company's brand helps to communicate its value to customers and stand out from the competition. A personal brand does the same for individuals. It helps to communicate a clear value to potential employees or clients. Basically, a personal brand is just your story, the story that puts you in front of you. And the story can play an important role in establishing or boosting your career or helping your small business or startup. In fact, an overwhelming 85% of hiring managers now report that a job's candidate's personal brand influences their hiring decisions. You'll very rarely see me without a hat. It's part of my personal brand. And my personal brand is all about explaining entrepreneurship, startups, and personal brands. So that's kind of my thing. But your personal brand has to highlight your strength. It has to establish a reputation. It has to help build trust. It has to communicate the unique attributes that you bring to your current or desired industry. Cultivated well, meaning over time, your personal brand will signal to employees or clients whether or not you'll be the right fit for what they want you for. But let's get practical. I thought I'd end on something very practical. Tips for building your personal brand. You need to develop a personal brand that has incremental steps, right? Small things you can do over time that will only build to your foundation. One, figure out who you are. In order to build a personal brand that accurately reflects your personal and professional identity, your first need is to know who you are. So be introspective and create a list of your personal strengths and weaknesses. Ask yourself, in which areas of work do I excel? What motivates me? What characteristics have others complimented me on? Which roles seem to drain my energy? And which roles give me so much power and passion? If you're struggling to answer these questions, ask friends, family, co-workers, how do they describe you? Once you've got these facets of your personality, once you've got these lists, you've got something to build your brand on. And keep in mind that many people struggle to choose a specific niche because they don't want to limit themselves, but realize that niches equal riches. Realize that your personal brand, like any other corporate brand, will change over time, but must start on a singular thing. The best strategy is to choose a particular area you'd like to focus on, and then let it evolve over time. Determine what you want to be known for is number two. Your personal brand is more than a reflection of who you are today. It's a roadmap of where you're going. In addition to understanding your existing skills and competencies, I suggest you access your strengths and weaknesses as they relate to whichever industry or career you want to break into. So if it's events and tourism, or hospitality and tourism, or events and hospitality, think about, what do you need in that? You need to understand people, you need to be friendly, you need to be open, you need to be compassionate, you need to show kindness, you need to show diversity, you need to be able to pull all this into your personal brand. It's just a series of steps. But to know what steps you're taking, you need to know who your audience is, which is number 3. Before you start crafting your personal brand, you also need to determine who you're trying to reach. Is it other industries' thought leaders, an individual at a particular company? Is it recruiters? The sooner you define the audience, the easier it will be to craft your story, because you'll better understand the type of story you need to craft and then to tell many people about. For example, if your goal is to reach hiring managers and recruiters, you might start by creating or updating your LinkedIn profile. Why? Because 92% of recruiters now leverage social media to find high quality candidates. And of those, 87% use LinkedIn as of my recent research. On the other hand, if you're trying to be a graphic designer, trying to impress existing clients and attract new customers, you might choose to tell your story via a website or a portfolio of work through social media like Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, which show your range of talents. But research your desired industry and follow experts. That's number 4. If you start mapping out the careers you want, I recommend compiling research on experts in those roles. When in doubt, look about. Find out who the thought leaders are, whatever fields you're interested in, and don't just follow them. Go out and comment on them. Make them notice you. Contribute to their thinking. Remark on their remarks. Retweet with a comment. Don't just retweet. In building a personal brand, your goal is to stand out, hence the hat. But you can't rise to the top without taking inventory of who already is out there. As you begin to conceptualize your personal brand, spend time crafting an elevator pitch, 30 to 60-second story about who you are. Whether you're attending a networking event or an informal party or having an elevator pitch, literally an elevator from the ground floor to the penthouse, find a way to describe succinctly what you do, who you do it for, and where you'd like to go by doing it. Very short, very concise thing to say. Maybe a story that's easy to share. I always say, I'm an eventrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur who did incredibly well in events, and events are just storytelling, and now I do that through audio marketing. That's it. So reinvent your personal brand as you grow. As the digital ecosystem changes and your career evolves, so will your personal brand. Adjust your persona accordingly to meet different people, to find new networking opportunities and grow in your career. As long as it reflects your professional life, don't hesitate to create a brand that lets you shine. I hope I've had the chance today to educate you, to inspire you, to entertain you. Whether you use these tips to become an entrepreneur or start a startup or build your personal brand, promise me to have fun. Don't take it too seriously. Make as much money as you can. Spend it on things that count, but spend the majority on health. But if you have health, you have hope. And if you have hope, you have everything. When you have all that money and you've done everything you can, give it all away before you die. None of it really matters. In the end, only 3 things really matter. Did you live? Did you love? Did you matter? Thank you.